Hey guys, it's Elena. Welcome back to my channel. So this week we are making something very special. I am making a gender neutral baby blanket quilt and it's gingham, of course. I love how it turned out. I think it's so perfect and I'm excited to show you how I did it. So I wanted to first start off by saying that I originally found this tutorial from Quilter's Candy from Pinterest. They have a free pattern where they lay it out on a PDF. I will put a link down below where I found that, but I'm going to give you some similar information. And this is everything that you'll need to purchase fabric-wise, and then everything that you'll need to cut out. So you'll have your fabric A, B, and C, and then you'll have your binding and backing fabric. Once you have cut everything else out and you have all of your strips, you're first going to separate everything. So first you need to group together 5 of your fabric A and 6 of your fabric B. I'm calling A the white, B the medium, and then C the dark. The next grouping is 5 of fabric B and 6 of fabric C. Once you get those grouped together, we're just gonna go start and preparing the rest of our fabric. So I am sewing together both pieces of my backing. So I have one big piece of backing, and now I am preparing all of my binding. So to make binding, I have a bunch of 2.5 inch strips of fabric. So I'm gonna take one piece of binding, another piece of binding, and overlap it at the corners at a 90-degree angle. You want everything to match up and be super straight. And then I'm just taking a ruler and marking with a piece of chalk from one corner to the other at a diagonal. And then I'm sewing with my sewing machine just straight where I put that chalk. And you can see here, now I have a non-bulky seam when I go to fold my binding in half. So to start putting the actual front of your quilt together, you're going to start with your first grouping, which is of your lightest pieces of fabric. So you're going to take one of your fabric B's and one of your fabric A's and just sew down together the long length of your strips. Once you have sewn down one of those lengths, now you have this long strip, and next you're going to take one more of your fabric B and put it right sides together of your fabric A, the lightest one, and sew down just like you did previously. We're basically alternating the lightest and medium light strips to make one giant striped sheet of fabric. So once you've done that completely for the first grouping, you're going to do the exact same thing for the second grouping. So instead, you're going to start with your darkest fabric again, which is C, and then take your lighter fabric, which in this case is fabric B, and put them together right sides together and sew down the longest length. Once you've done that completely for the first time, you're going to take your next piece of fabric, which is your darker fabric, fabric C, put it right sides together to the lighter piece of fabric, B, and sew down, again, right sides together all the way down the length of your fabric to start forming that big striped sheet. Here's what it's starting to look like. Now I have 3. You can start to see the alternating, and this is what that sheet looks like all completely done. There are some weird lengths here just because the fabric that I bought were different widths. So I'm just trimming to make sure that everything is a nice big giant square. I don't have any weird strips sticking out anywhere. And now I am just folding that giant sheet into a more manageable size so that I can start cutting long strips. you are going to need to cut strips that are 5.5 inches wide. And you're going to do that the entire width of your giant sheet of striped fabric for both the grouping of A and the grouping of B. Once you have laid everything out and you know the order that you want all of your strips going, you're gonna first take one of the darker strips at the very top and take the next strip, which is going to be a little bit lighter, and start at the top, match them up, and nest those seams as good as you can, and just start sewing down. It's a little bit difficult to get all of the seams to nest perfectly, like every single one of them all the way down, but if you just stretch and pull for some of them and not pull as much on some of them, you should be able to get it decently close, as long as you cut everything nice and even. Once you've put 2 of your strips together, you can just keep going down the line and alternating the shade of strips that you have. So darker, lighter, darker, lighter, and just keep nesting until you get all the way to the end. Once you've done that a bunch more times and you have the entirety of the front of your quilt done, we can start moving on to assembling. So you're going to take your giant backing piece and tape it to the floor. Get it as smooth out as you possibly can. You don't want any puckering. And then you're going to pull out the batting that you have. I chose a thinner 100% cotton batting, and I just laid it directly on top of the wrong side of my backing. I'm just smoothing out all the lumps and making sure, again, it's as smooth as possible. And then I am laying the front of my quilt right on top. So we have 3 layers going on. We've got our backing, our batting, and then the top of our quilt. And next I'm just gonna start from the center of my quilt and start pinning outwards every other square. And now I'm going to start the actual quilting process of my quilt. So I have decided to sew down to the left and right of each seam. So this was a big endeavor, but I started from the very center of my quilt, started at the top and just went all the way down in one line, doing about 1/4 inch away from the center of that particular seam. So I did the right side of the center seam, and now I'm just going to sew to the left of that center seam. So I'm lining it up with the edge of my presser foot, and then I'm just going straight down, making sure that things are as smooth as possible. And if it requires that you take out any of the safety pins along the way, go ahead and do so. The goal is to get everything to, again, sit as flat and smooth as you possibly can get it. I did have to go back and readjust a couple times, but this is what it's going to look like on the front and the back. It's just going to be lots of strips of sewing. So once you do the whole left side of the quilt, do the whole right side of the quilt, and then you can start going the other direction. So I've gone left to right, so now I'm going up and down. After that's done, I'm just going and securing the outside edge border of my quilts. This probably isn't completely necessary, but it just made me feel a little bit more secure going into the next steps, and making sure that I am, again, trying to keep things as smooth and flat as possible. I do not want any puckering at this stage, because that's going to make my life really difficult in the future, and also just not going to make it look really nice. So do your best to keep things as flat and smooth as possible. Do some nice pivoting at the corners, and then this is what you're going to get. Once you've done that to all of the edges, it is finally time to trim off all of that excess junk all the way around your quilt. Don't cut any of the top of your quilt, but cut off any excess backing and batting. Now you can finish preparing your binding. So I'm just trimming any excess fabric where I connected the strips, and I am just ironing that whole big long length in half. So just to get started with my binding, I fold it in one corner at a 45-degree angle, and I'm only sewing on the inside of my binding. So I put my binding right sides together to the top of my quilt. I'm sewing down just a little bit until I've secured that little flat. Then I'm lifting up my presser foot, and I'm gonna put back down the rest of my binding and then go back to the front beginning of my binding and sew down the binding, the whole binding, to the front of the quilt. So this little binding piece is one piece folded in half that I am sewing the raw edge to the raw edge of my quilt. You can use a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance here, and then once you get to the edge, you're gonna stop about a 1/4 inch away from the edge and then sew at a 45-degree angle to the very edge of the corner, so it's gonna look like a little diagonal here. What I'm doing next is I'm pulling my binding straight up and then straight back down, and I want it to look like a 90-degree angle. And then I'm just gonna literally start straight back up and start going all the way down. If you can, make sure to backstitch at this part, and it will help things be really nice and secure at the very end. So once you reach the end of your binding, this is my favorite way to end binding. You're just gonna trim your binding with a couple of inches overlap. Not too much, but not too little. And then you're just gonna stick that little tail of excess binding into the nice little pocket that you left for yourself in the very beginning. It's already at an angle, so it's not going to be super bulky, and it's just going to look really nice and completely blended in. Yeah, do you see how nice this looks? And it's so easy. I literally cannot believe how easy finishing off this binding is. Cake. It's cake. So look, once you flip it over, it's gonna blend right in just like all of the other pieces of your binding. So once the front of your binding is done, it's time to flip everything over, and here you can see the mitered corner from the front, and it looks so good. And then from the back, you're basically just gonna fold one side down and then fold the other side just right on top. So I know a lot of people use clips. I don't happen to have any, so I'm just going and pinning all the way around my quilt. So this took some time. You want to make sure that you're being as, careful and consistent as you possibly can. And then I prefer to machine bind just because I don't like hand sewing. So this is sped up. Please go slow, but we're gonna do a stitch in the ditch. So you're going to sew and put your needle right in between the binding and where it's connected to the quilt. This is how I do it. I literally have my face smashed up against my sewing machine and I go very slow. So take your time and get it to catch front on your quilt. And once you do, oh my gosh, look at this masterpiece. Look at this cute yellow, sunny, bright gingham quilt. I am obsessed. I love the lemons. I love the little pop of mint. I genuinely love how it looks. I feel like the corners look amazing, and I'm actually really happy with how the quilting came out. And I feel like, again, the corners look great, the binding looks great, the quilting looks great. There's no puckers on the back. All in all, A+. This was a great pattern and tutorial, and I love how it turned out. So hope you guys enjoyed this tutorial. Hope it was helpful, and I will see you in the next one.